Thank you. Senator Wright. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. As a Queensland Senator, I rise to speak against the G20 Safety and Security Complementary Bill 2014, and I echo the concerns of my colleague Green Senator Penny Wright about the Queensland Newman government's attacks on civil liberties and democratic rights. For 2 years I've watched as the state LNP government under Campbell Newman has taken my home state of Queensland further and further down a very dark road. Since they were elected in 2012, I've watched the Newman government launch savage budget cuts, sack 14,000 nurses, school teachers and other public servants, roll back a litany of environmental protections and vilify or isolate anyone who doesn't share their views. I've watched them impose ever more pernicious and dangerous restrictions on civil liberties, sliding back to the bad old days of Sir Joe. This bill would facilitate the imposition of draconian and unnecessary laws in Queensland in relation to the G20 conference, under the guise of safety and security. Of course, the safety of everyone, including protesters, at such events is of critical importance. But the Queensland legislation which this bill facilitates goes far beyond what is required. It tramples on the fundamental rights of peaceful protest and freedom of assembly. We are being asked not only to ignore the Newman government's continuous disregard for civil liberties, but to facilitate the implementation of those restrictions by passing this bill. We're being asked to stand by while these laws are waved through, but the Greens will not. We will oppose this bill. The Queensland G20 legislation goes well beyond previous security measures in Australia, beyond those seen at the 2007 APEC conference in Sydney and the 2011 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Perth. By itself, that should ring alarm bells. Police in Queensland already have the power to deal with breaches of the peace, and offences already exist for the assault, unlawful assembly and for riot. The Queensland Law Society has told us that there is no need to create new offences. The laws make it illegal to disrupt any part of the G20. Unfortunately, disrupt is not defined. Presumably it also includes making noise which can be heard inside the meetings. However much Prime Minister Tony Abbott would like to avoid hearing the many voices calling for stronger action on climate change and compassion for those living in poverty overseas, clamping down on free speech is not the way to go. The laws create extraordinary powers for police to enter property and carry out searches without a warrant and without the requirement for a reasonable suspicion of an offence. These powers include frisk searches and strip searches under certain circumstances. The laws create a range of ill-defined new offences which will make it extremely difficult for people to know whether they are acting lawfully or not, and these offences have penalties ranging up to $11,000. A person who may disrupt any part of the G20 can be declared to be a prohibited person by the Police Commissioner, and on that basis they're subject to eviction from security areas and to increased search powers. There is no obligation to inform those affected in a timely manner, and they will have no opportunity to challenge this blacklisting. Evidence forming the basis of these designations will be kept secret. These laws create a list of prohibited items, which is extremely broad. It includes common protest items such as large banners and megaphones, but it also strays into the ludicrous. Amongst the banned items are surfboards, cans of food, eggs and lizards. Under these laws, if someone is arrested for a non-violent offence involving disrupting the G20, a presumption against bail is created. That, of course, reverses the normal bail rules, something which is reserved only for the worst offences, such as murder. These laws have been rightly condemned by human rights lawyers, the Queensland Civil Liberties Council and the Queensland Law Society. The Canadian government imposed similar laws when Toronto hosted the G20 conference in 2010. During that conference, over 1,100 people were arrested, of whom only 40 were ever convicted of an offence. 779 were released without charge. Over 30 police, including 4 senior officers, were recommended for disciplinary hearings. It was the largest mass arrest in Canadian peacetime history. The vague nature of the Queensland laws and the extraordinary powers conferred on police mean that the risk of abuse and discrimination by police, especially against homeless people and young people, is acute. The G20 should be an opportunity to reaffirm and protect fundamental rights and freedoms, not to needlessly undermine them. Of particular concern to the civil liberties of Queenslanders is the restrictions imposed on the Cairns Central Business District in the September session of the conference. The rate of homelessness in Cairns is significantly higher than the average rate of homelessness in Queensland, and these laws are particularly concerning for the welfare and well-being of homeless persons, who may be targeted as breaching the ill-defined disruption clauses of the G20 laws. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up approximately 16% of homeless people in Cairns, which is double the state average. It is deeply concerning that the Newman government would rather impose temporary laws to hide a gross injustice from the rest of the world than to actually find positive solutions for the situations of one of Queensland's most marginalised groups. On this issue, the Queensland State Labor Party have shown a disheartening lack of backbone. Opposition police spokesman Bill Byrne MP has actually told the state parliament that the legislation should have gone further. He says, "I am somewhat surprised that some of the offence provisions have quite light sentences attached, and I consider the boundaries of the restricted and declared areas to be minimalist," says Mr Byrne. The legal changes that I've described are deeply troubling, but of course they come against the context and the background of the way Premier Newman's government has trashed the independence of what was one of the best anti-corruption bodies in Australia, the CMC. New legislation gives the Newman government total control over the appointment of the chair of the CMC, scrapping the system of bipartisan appointments. The government-appointed chair now has extraordinary powers to veto or terminate any investigation, turning the CMC into a one-man band. And the Attorney-General now has the power to veto any research project launched by the CMC. The legislation also criminalises complaint, with penalties for making a reckless complaint. This attack on the CMC comes after allegations that the government's hand-picked acting CMC chair misled the CMC's Parliamentary Oversight Committee. When that committee began an investigation, the Premier and Attorney-General sacked the whole committee and reconstituted it with a compliant government majority. Tony Fitzgerald, whose anti-corruption inquiry brought down another Conservative Queensland government all those years ago, has called Premier Newman and Attorney-General Blay inexperienced, arrogant fools in response to this outrageous attack on one of Australia's finest corruption-fighting bodies. Mr Fitzgerald has said that these changes are the final step needed to remove the Commission's independence entirely and bring it under complete government control. Undermining civil liberties is in fact the only thing that the Queensland LNP government has shown any talent for whatsoever. Since coming to power, Campbell Newman's government has embarked on an unprecedented campaign to rip up fundamental rights, including but not limited to free speech, freedom of association, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment and equality before the law. The now infamous VLAD laws, or Vicious Lawless Associations Disestablishment Act, is the perfect example. It has been sold as only applying to illegal motorcycle gangs, but of course it doesn't. It doesn't mention motorcycles once. It applies to any gathering of 3 or more people who may be part of a formal or informal organisation, whose purpose includes committing certain offences. The Queensland Law Society has warned that these laws are so broad that they could apply to virtually any type of club or association: swimming clubs, RSLs, school P&Cs, or indeed a group of friends out for a stroll. The VLAD Act imposes truly enormous mandatory sentences, either 15 or 25 years without parole. As barrister and human rights advocate Stephen Keim SC has said, the VLAD Act will not be wheeled out on every occasion it could be used. It will be used for the disadvantaged and unpopular. And this is precisely why civil liberties are important. Abuse always begins when the government finds a public scapegoat, but that scapegoat will not remain the primary target for very long. Brash law and order policies are a smokescreen for other attacks on the disadvantaged and the voiceless, including cuts to health and education, injured workers and the natural environment. It's our duty to call out this deception wherever we see it and to oppose these senseless attacks on civil liberties. The actions of Campbell Newman and the government are the actions of a bully. This is our chance to stand up to the bullies in the Queensland LNP government. This bill offers an opportunity for all parties to stand up to the creeping attacks on civil liberties by the Queensland LNP government, and I call on all parties to oppose it. Sadly, I note that it's very telling that both big parties are backing this bill. On the G20, climate change clearly will be the biggest cost to our economy in the long term, but it is not on the agenda at the G20. Even though our allies have reached out and asked that climate change be discussed, Mr Tony Abbott's fingers remain firmly fixed in his ears. Prime Minister Abbott has the blinkers fixed tight over his eyes and seems to care naught for the effect on our environment or Australian jobs or economic security in the long term. We also see that fossil fuel subsidies, which have been previously discussed, are not on the agenda at the G20. And I note with some amusement and horror that Australia has previously used its diplomatic weight to change the resolution on fossil fuel subsidies to be a ban on inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, of course then arguing that Australia's fossil fuel subsidies were somehow efficient and therefore exempt from that ban. I want to also touch on gender equality. We saw this morning a report released by Oxfam showing that and calling for gender equality and participation to be on the agenda at the G20, putting gender on the agenda if you like. The report out today shows globally it would take about 75 years for women to achieve equal pay. The unpaid work that women do is subsidising the economy. Women do an average of 2 to 5 hours more unpaid work than do men, says this report this morning. And of course we know in Australia that we still have more than a 17% gender pay gap, and women still do more than 70% of the unpaid caring work. But instead of these important issues being put on the G20 agenda, we see more silencing dissent from this government. They don't want to talk about those key issues at the G20, and they want to unnecessarily restrict the rights of not just protesters, but also local residents during the G20. The Greens will stand up for civil liberties and freedom of association, and we will oppose this draconian bill.
Thank you.